Hi and welcome. So, my name is Julie Hemmings, and I'm a senior yoga teacher with the Yoga Alliance Professionals here in the UK. I've been teaching yoga for about 26 years, and during that time, I have developed a real interest and passion for some of the more inwardly focusing limbs of yoga, specifically pranayama. And that's something that I want to share with you today, just some simple theory and practices around the idea of breath retentions. So, breath retentions are something that is quite familiar with yogic breathing. We come across it a lot in our classes and in our trainings, but it can be a little bit misunderstood and also a little bit scary as well. And if we look at some of the older yogic texts, we're often asked to hold our breath or retain our breath for things like 64 seconds, 34 seconds. And this can be a little bit challenging for most of us, if not downright scary. So, in this short workshop presentation, what I would like to share with you is the theory and the concept of breath retentions, to understand what they are, looking at some of the older texts, but also to understand why they're important. Why do we need them? Why do we need to hold our breath as part of our yoga practice? And then what I want to do is take you through a short practice where you can begin that process of introducing breath retentions within your practice. So I hope you enjoy it. So, breath retentions are known as kumbhakas. That's the Sanskrit word for holding the breath. And there are two variations of these that we can employ during our breathing practice. So, the first one is the internal retention, the Antar Kumbhaka, as it's known. And this is where we hold the breath at the end of our inhalation. This is probably the breath retention that most people find manageable and achievable. So most of us have held our breath at some point during our lives. So things like when we've been shocked or frightened, when we're suppressing a sneeze, when we put our head underwater. So for most people, the concept of holding their breath at the end of a retention, so holding their breath in, may seem quite comfortable. But we also have a retention at the end of the exhalation as well. And this is known as the Bahiya Kumbhaka. This is the one that a lot of people struggle with mostly. So holding our breath when we're empty, holding our breath out, and sustaining or suspending our breath in that state can be a little bit challenging for people, because we're empty, there's nothing there, and there is a certain amount of fear surrounding that practice. So that can often be the more difficult one to introduce. So, when we look at the texts, the yogic texts that we study as part of our training, one of the 8 limbs is pranayama, and Patanjali says about pranayama, it's chapter 2, verse 49. And he introduces pranayama and says, pranayama is the regulation of the incoming and outgoing flow of breath with retention. And that idea of retaining the breath is paramount in what Patanjali considers to be the practice of pranayama. So essentially, if we're not holding our breath while we are focusing on our breathing, then we're not actually practicing pranayama. So that's how Patanjali looks at it. And then to sort of develop the reasons why. Why do we need to hold our breath? Why is it important? One of my favourite quotes comes from the Hatha Yoga Pradipika on the chapter on pranayama. And it's chapter 2, verse 2. And it says, when prana moves, chitta moves. So prana is our life force energy that we are bringing in when we are breathing. So prana travels on the air, but it exists in other things as well. But breathing is one of the ways that we can control the flow and the fluctuations of prana in our body. So when prana is moving, when we're breathing in and out, chitta, or the mental force, is also moving. When prana is without movement, chitta is without movement. So when prana isn't moving, which happens when we are holding our breath, when we retain our breath, then chitta isn't moving either. So the mind comes into a state of stillness. And so it's this quote really that sums everything up. So basically, when we're breathing normally, the mind can fluctuate. When we suspend and retain our breath, when we stop the breath, the mind stops as well. So it's in this way that the breath retentions, the kumbhakas of pranayama, are not only useful for the pranayama practice, for controlling our breath, but they also act as a really good preparation for the later stages of yoga, which are meditation. So before we go on to have a look at our practice and how we can start to develop these breath retentions, we need to have a look at who can't do these practices. So there are certain medical conditions where breath holding is not recommended. So that is things like heart conditions, high blood pressure, low blood pressure for the Baye Kumbhaka, so for the held out breath, low blood pressure is contraindicated there. Any eye ailments, so where pressure building up in the head would be a bad idea. So things like glaucoma, weak eye capillaries, all those kinds of ailments. And also asthma. So not doing any breath holding when there's asthma present unless it's being done under supervision. And finally, we have to also think about trauma. So people may have had instances where they have felt suffocated, they might have had a drowning incident. So working with people with those histories may also be, there may need to be some sensitivity that we employ. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is take you through a short guided practice that you can use to introduce breath holding or breath retaining in your classes. So, providing you don't have any of those contraindications that we just looked at, I'd like to invite you to come into a comfortable seated position. So, making sure that you are comfortable in your hips, comfortable in your spine. The chest should be nice and open, so no rounding of the back, so open chest, resting the hands onto the legs. And then if you could close your eyes, if you feel comfortable to do that, so that you can internalize your awareness. I'm just taking a moment to settle the body into stillness. And once the body feels still, just turning your attention to your breath. And just begin by observing the inhalation and the exhalation. And once you've made your connection, then begin to breathe in more fully. So inviting the breath to move into the lower, middle and upper sections of the lungs. Inviting the breath to move away from the lower, middle and upper sections of the lungs. And just feeling that you are engaging with a little more control over the breath. And then from there, just begin to connect with a soft, subtle Ujjayi breath. So ocean breath, where the throat is very softly contracted. And listening to the sound of your breath as you continue to work with your Ujjayi breathing. A slow, steady, full inhalation, followed by a slow, steady, full exhalation. And then what I would like to invite you to do is, at the end of your next inhalation, just wait for a moment. So you're just going to pause. You're not holding the breath in any way, but just waiting until the out-breath wants to come. So this is a natural space that we are introducing between the inhalation and the exhalation. So just continuing in that same way, long, steady inhalation. And then just pausing and waiting, observing that natural space and allowing the out-breath to come when it wants to. So in this way, we are introducing the concept of making a space between the breaths. So this is a very subtle way of working with the Antar Kumbhaka, the internal retention. But because we're not counting it, we're not asking ourselves or any of our students to adhere to any specific count. There is a certain quality of peace and achievability with this practice. And it can often be the case as this pause and this pausing becomes familiar, that sometimes the natural pause when we aren't counting it can even be longer than some of the counted ratios that we may use in our classes. So just continuing in that same way. Slow, steady inhalation with Ujjayi breath. And then just inviting that space, watching the emptiness. The emptiness of the mind, not the emptiness of the breath. Seeing if the mind also pauses as we pause the breath. You may be able to comfortably extend that natural pause between the inhalation and the exhalation quite considerably, while still maintaining comfort and control. And then if you feel comfortable to move on to the external retention, I'm going to invite you to do the same process at the end of the exhale. So once you have completed your exhalation, just waiting and pausing again until the inhalation wants to rise. So you might find that the external pause at the end of the exhalation is a lot shorter, and that's okay. So here we are just exploring the spaces. We're not trying to achieve any particular count. We're just introducing the concept of these spaces within the full breathing cycle. With the Ujjayi breath, you also have the opportunity to hear the spaces, to hear the stillness between the breaths. So of course you can practice this at home for as long as you like. You can introduce it into your classes and make it a longer practice. But for now, for this workshop, if you would like to just complete one more round, and then once you have completed that round, just letting go of the Ujjayi breath. Letting go of the spaces in between, but they may still be there. And then just allowing your breathing to find its own natural rhythm. And notice how that feels. Notice how the breath feels. So your natural breath now may be different, but also notice how the mind feels. And then when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes and maybe move your body. So we can also integrate that style of breathing into our asana practice as well. So particularly with a short class, if you don't have a lot of time to work with breath, work with breath retentions, then you can integrate this into poses. So any pose will work with this, and it tends to slow the poses down as well. So it makes our vinyasas slower. You can work with this in Surya Namaskar. You can work with it in yin yoga poses where we're holding the poses for a long time. Even in warm-up poses like cat, it's a lovely way to introduce this breath. So working into cat, inhaling, arching the spine, just having a little pause here, and then rounding the back the other way, having a little pause at the end of the exhale. And it gives us the opportunity to actually experience the poses in greater detail as well. So that's something that you might want to explore and play around with. So I hope you've enjoyed this short workshop. So just a quick look at what kumbhakas are, why we practice them, why they're important, and just a few simple methods to start to introduce them into your classes and also into your own practice. And then once you feel familiar and comfortable with that slow breath and the natural pauses, it will then be a fairly easy transition into actually working with the counted breaths. Thank you so much. Hari Om Tat Sat.